Welcome
to the Michael Smerconish program.
Hey gang, thanks so much for being here. It was 30 years ago tonight that I marked the beginning of my career in talk radio.
Well, I don't know why I came here tonight. I got the feeling that something ain't right. I'm so scared in case I fall off my chair. And I'm wondering how I'll get down the stairs.
I met Ronald Reagan. I twice interviewed President Barack Obama. I drank champagne from the Stanley Cup. I had a 7-hour dinner with Fidel Castro at his house. I host a daily radio program that bears my name. I have a weekly cable television program, and I've authored 7 books. I'm pleased with those achievements, but I am far more proud of what went into them.
Rolling.
Okay, bring it down. That'll be good. Just make that strong.
Wait, I think you need to go back and copy a little bit.
In anticipation of this next move, we're going to redo some stuff here on the scared.
Well, you know what they say about the best laid plans, right? Welcome to the show I was about to take out on the road before the pandemic hit. As you watch, ask yourself, which changed more in the last 30 years? The country or me?
Okay, here we go, and action.
Of course I talk for a living. It's always been my calling. And not because I'm a lawyer, not because I have a background in politics. In retrospect, I guess I just wanted the attention. Ever since childhood, which was spent at 24 Mercer Avenue in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, 25 feet from the houses next door. The Schutz were on one side, the Wrigleys were on the other. And that's where my parents raised my brother and me. As we grew older, Mom worked as a secretary, then launched this remarkable career as a realtor. My dad was a public school teacher turned guidance counselor. And after hours, he ran the adult education program at the county prison, enabling inmates to get their GEDs. And a few of those inmates, the guys who were on work release, sometimes they did renovations on our house, which is how we finally got an indoor shower installed in our bathroom when I was in the 8th grade. And it's how our basement was turned into what we called a rec room. Surrounded by this paneling from Kmart, that's where my brother and I would sit on these hideously colored beanbag chairs and watch TV. And long before cable television, we had just 6 channels. There was 3, 6, and 10, 17, 29, and 48. And the last 2, they carried pro wrestling. Saturday mornings. This was the age of the living legend, Bruno Sammartino, and Haystacks Calhoun, George the Animal Steele, and my favorite, Chief Jay Strongbow. There were good guys and there were bad guys, and there was no in between. You knew the bad guys because they often had managers. You know, the Grand Wizard of Wrestling, Classy Freddie Blassie, the Captain Lou Albano. And the only time that I remember any confusion as to who we should root for came one Saturday morning when Pedro Morales and Bruno Sammartino, 2 good guys, were in a tag team title match against Professor Toru Tanaka and Mr. Fuji. And during the course of the bout, Tanaka and Fuji, the bad guys, they rubbed salt into the eyes of Sammartino and Morales. And those 2, the good guys, they got confused. They started fighting each other. And eventually they had to settle their differences in a grudge match that they had at Shea Stadium. Now, of course, in no time they made up and they were back to fighting bad guys. My brother and I, we would take turns acting out the parts. I would imitate Chief Jay Strongbow's war dance. And I remember we even had a fake WWF title belt. Sometimes my parents would take us to matches where I would try to get autographs of good guys and bad guys, like Mr. Fuji. These are some of the fondest memories of my childhood. And who knew that I would go on to make my living in the media equivalent of pro wrestling? because that's what talk radio and some parts of cable television have become. It's all about entertainment. One side is virtuous, the other side is evil. The outcome of every fight is predetermined, depending on which channel you're tuned to. Back then, adults knew that wrestling was fake. They treated it accordingly. But today, the media equivalent is conflating with news reporting, and the nation is suffering. More on that later. Besides my fondness for pro wrestling, there were other signs that I would be drawn to a career that involved faux fights and talking for a living, like phony phone calls. Yeah, we made them. And of course, we called the local drugstore. You know this one, right? Do you have Prince Albert in a can? Well, you better let him out or he'll suffocate. Today, I still have committed to memory the telephone number of the local pizzeria in my hometown, Dominic's, because of all the times that we would call and place the most complicated orders we could invent. Yeah, I'll take a half pepperoni, a quarter sausage, 1/8 green pepper, 1/24 mushroom. Terrible, I know. 348-9656. 348-9656. That, of course, is before there were area codes and caller ID. Before cable television and satellite radio, this was the heyday of AM radio. And in Philadelphia, the big AM music radio station was WFIL, Philly 56. And Philly 56 put out an album of all the hits of the day. And we had a copy, this copy. One of the songs on the album was from a Philly guy. 1972, a Philly guy who had been with a group called Nas, Todd Rundgren. And the song was Hello, It's Me. I'm not sure why we picked it, but here was the deal. My brother would call people out of the Doylestown telephone book, you know, the white pages, right? And he would tell them that we were a garage band and we were rehearsing our new single, and we wanted to play it for them. Now, we thought we were pranking them. I'm sure the joke was really on us. And then my brother would say, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that was my command, because I would be at the turntable with the vinyl record. And I would have to put the needle down when he got to 4. Only many times I would miss the mark and the record would scratch or start in the middle of the song. Like that. Let me try again. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we lived at 24 Mercer Avenue, and down at the other end of the street at 42 Mercer Avenue were the Stockles. Mike and Arlene were the parents. Their kids were Mike Jr., my friend, and Kelly. Mike Sr. worked for Sylvan Pools for many years, and the Stockles had the only in-ground pool on the street. And so that's where we gathered, every summer. We called it Stockle Valley Country Club. And I remember that one time the neighborhood kids were recruited for the opportunity to sing a jingle for Sylvan Pools for a radio commercial that was going to play on our town's tiny radio station, WBUX, literally located in a cow pasture. Like the Dominic's Pizza telephone number, that too is cemented in my memory. I never needed the script. Before you take the plunge, be sure you talk to Sylvan. Before you take the plunge, be sure you get the facts. Family engineered for fun and recreation. Sylvan has the pool to keep you all relaxed. In that era, Doug Henning was a magician. He had a hit on Broadway called The Magic Show. And Henning inspired kids all over the country to take up magic. Like all the malls suddenly had magic stores. like the yo-yo, like the pet rock. This was a big thing in the 70s. In my case, it wasn't just a parlor game. I did shows, kids' birthday parties mainly. Mr. Gardy was a family friend and a local printer. He gave me the gift of business cards with my name on them. And they said, fee, donation. Well, later I started to charge $5 per show. A local library was my biggest gig ever. About 100 kids attended in Quakertown, Pennsylvania. And for the finale, I had a kid in the audience put handcuffs on me, and I then escaped from a locked trunk. I wrote diary entries for each performance. Of course I saved them. Thank you, Marie Kondo. Diary entry, May 30, 1975. Tomorrow will be one of my last magic shows. I've lost interest with about 3 more shows to do. I'll probably sell my stuff and put the money into something good. I think it'll be tough, though, selling my stuff, but I'll try. Magic was fun and profitable for some time. It's been a great hobby. I'm the last of all my friends in this art. I love that part. I find myself nervous and dreading shows that Mom and Dad have gotten for me. The strange thing is that after I've done a show with an appreciative audience, I feel good, and I think to myself that I should stay in the hobby. For the most part, my shows have all been fine. I perform better with large audiences and much room to walk and perform at the same time. I think back to the Yugo, that would be Yugoslavian Picnic, and the Telford Country Club, as well as the Quakertown Library. These were my 3 best shows, and they all had large audiences as well as room to wander. I hope I'll have good luck with my remaining shows. Well, sadly, that was not the case. Here's the next diary entry. This show was for my cousin Brian's birthday party. A young boy about 8 was there. He does magic, and he told every secret I had. I just couldn't stop him. As a result, the show didn't go over so well. Audience size, 12. Pay, $10. If my love for pro wrestling and phony phone calls and magic summed up elementary school, it would be television that symbolized junior high school. Hollycong Junior High School specifically, before we started calling them middle schools. It was a brand new public school, nice and modern, with its own closed-circuit television system and a TV studio. And morning announcements were delivered from this TV studio, and then they would reach every homeroom because they all had televisions that were tuned into that studio. So I caught the TV bug. I wanted to be a morning anchor, but I never made the cut. So one day, the school TV crew came to my gym class. They were filming a TV commercial for an upcoming gym show. So there I am. I'm in my school-issued gym uniform, right? White T-shirt, white shorts. And to be a wise guy, I flicked a moon on camera. Do they still call it that? We all stood around and we watched the playback and laughed. Like Nixon, I guess I should have erased the tape, but I didn't. So word spread, and soon everybody was stopping by the school TV studio to watch the tape, the playback of my naked ass. And before too long, the school vice principal, Mr. Roberts, called my dad at his school and said, Walt, I've got some bad news. I need to suspend Michael because he's exposed himself. My poor old man, scared to death, thinking that I'd walked out of the boys' room in like a London fog trench coat with nothing on underneath and flashed all the students. And worse, my poor mother was asked to come to school to identify my naked butt on film. She did, but I think they were both kind of relieved. And it would not be the last time that my ass would get me in trouble. I was a good athlete in junior high at Hollycon, quarterback, pitcher, 2 championship teams, but I was about to be a small fish in a big pond. High school. Central Bucks West, best known as a statewide perennial football powerhouse under a legendary coach named Mike Pettin. Kevin Ward was our starting quarterback. He was an All-American in both football and baseball. He would go on to star in both sports at the University of Arizona and play professional baseball for the San Diego Padres. This guy was a stud. Nevertheless, I was able to letter on a championship football team as a third-string quarterback, holding for extra points for the kicker, my friend, Mark Amoroso. Of course, there's a story. I had promised Ammo a case of Heineken at the end of season if he let me hold. He did. I paid the debt. But now I had other interests. I was a 2-time class president, interested in politics. And like other kids, I often wrote letters to my sports idols. In my case, that was Bernie Parent, the goaltender of the Philadelphia Flyers, or Smokin' Joe Frazier, the Philadelphia-based heavyweight champion. I was the king of sending self-addressed stamped envelopes asking for autographs. By the way, shame that nobody does that anymore. No email or text can take the place of a letter. But I also wrote to politicians. Frank Rizzo was the 2-term Democratic mayor of the city of Philadelphia. We were a Republican household out in the burbs. But Rizzo was respected in our house. Probably an ethnic thing. I often wrote to Mayor Rizzo, and he wrote back. Meanwhile, in high school, my own political career was about to hit the rocks. The drinking age in Pennsylvania was 21 at the time. It was 18 in New Jersey, which was just a 25-minute drive away. It was a different time. All it took was a fake ID and you'd get served in Jersey. Always hustling, I sold fake IDs to classmates in need. And I got busted. So a letter comes home from the principal, Dr. Spar, and he says that I was prevented from running for a 3rd consecutive term as class president. Still, my senior year was to shape my political views in a way that I didn't realize at the time. See, in 1980, the spring of 1980, I turned 18 and registered to vote as a Republican, like my parents. That spring, my father decides to make a run for public office. He'd been active in our community. He'd never sought elective office before, and I became completely consumed in his campaign for the state legislature. I would spend Saturday and Sundays at the local Acme supermarket handing out rulers with his name on them. My first time as a voter, I got to vote for my dad and to cast my first presidential ballot, which was a dilemma. A dilemma for me because Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, Papa Bush, were still competing against one another at the time of the Pennsylvania primary, and I met them both within the same week as an 18-year-old first-time voter. I met Bush because he made a campaign appearance to the shrine at Czestochowa in my hometown. I remember it well because I got a brochure, and the brochure said, "George Bush, a president we won't have to train." The following day, I skipped school, high school, with my buddy Mike Stockel to meet Ronald Reagan. He was making what was then an obligatory Philadelphia campaign stop, walking through the 9th Street Italian Market. I had to work hard to get inside the same camera frame as my pal snapped away on a pocket Instamatic camera. You remember those with 110 film? I came home and I said to my parents, I wasn't sure which one I was going to vote for because I liked them both. Bush won the Pennsylvania primary. My dad lost his. But I was now hooked on politics and on the media. The dominant radio station in Philadelphia at that time was KYW News Radio. And part of their stranglehold on the city and the suburbs was that this is where you needed to go for school closing numbers on snow days. In other words, they would read this interminable list of numbers on wintry days, and we would sit close to transistor radios, waiting, hoping for our school number to be called, which meant there was no school. Well, KYW also had an internship program every year. And while I was in high school, I was a participant along with two buddies. And I think that's when I realized, when I walked into KYW and I saw both their radio and television studios, that's when I realized I loved that environment. I found them intoxicating. At the end of the internship, each student got to deliver a 1-minute radio segment on a news item from their hometown, and it was then played on radio. Mine was about the inmate education program run by my dad at the local jail. And this was the first time that my voice was heard on Philadelphia radio. May 2nd, 1980.
Correction officials at the Bucks County Prison in Doylestown are proud of their program of educating the inmates. All those behind bars have the option of attending adult education classes geared to their individual needs. Classes are conducted by tutors as well as area classroom teachers, many of whom are volunteers. With 318 inmates already having received their diplomas, the education program at the Bucks County Prison is an obvious success. I'm Mike Smerconish of Central Bucks West High School in Doylestown.
Of course, there was no money for me to be made yet in radio, but I always had summer jobs. I weeded and swept the sidewalk at a women's clothing store. I worked at McDonald's doing maintenance. I washed dishes at a local ice cream parlor, delivered Valentine's flowers. One summer with a friend and neighbor, Dave McFarland, lived across the street from me. We painted street address numbers on the curbs of thousands of local homes and then solicited donations from the homeowners, and we were usually paid $1. But mostly in the summers, I worked for the Stockles, our neighbors on Mercer Avenue. Mike Stockel had left Sylvan Pools, and with his wife Arlene, they had opened up a business that they called Mountain Lake Pool and Patio, and it was right at the end of our street. So I worked with Mike Jr. in the warehouse and delivering pool supplies and patio furniture. So one day, we get a plum assignment. Mike Sr. says to us, Larry Kane needs chlorine. He needs it delivered to his house in Rydell, Pennsylvania. This was big because Larry was the city's best-known newscaster. He was in the midst of a remarkable career, a career that began when he was just a 21-year-old reporter for a Miami radio station called, I love this, WFUN. So in 1964, when he's a Cub reporter, it's announced that the Beatles are going to play an unprecedented 35 concerts in 25 American cities during their maiden U.S. tour. So young Larry Kane sends a letter to band manager Brian Epstein on a letterhead that listed his own top 40 radio station and 6 others. So Epstein, the Beatles, they get this letter and they think that Larry's a big shot. They don't realize he's a Cub reporter looking for one interview. Instead, Epstein invites Larry Kane to accompany the Beatles on every stop of the tour. And my favorite part of the story, he didn't want to go. Just before the tour began, his mother Mildred had passed at the age of 40 from MS, multiple sclerosis. And meanwhile, his father, this grizzled World War II veteran, expressed misgivings. Larry, he said, you better watch your back. These guys are a menace to society. Still, Larry toured with the Beatles. He attended every Beatles concert in America in 1964 and 1965 and a couple in 1966. 46 Beatles concerts. He even watched 3 performances on The Ed Sullivan Show in person, which is why Ron Howard's movie, 8 Days a Week, relies so heavily on his narration. Well, Larry went on to anchor for all 3 Philadelphia network affiliates. He was the face of local television news as I grew up. And on that summer day, when we were delivering chlorine to his house, meeting him became our mission. So we drove in the panel truck, and we get to his house. We've got a bucket of chlorine in the back, and we were totally disappointed when a woman working in a domestic capacity answered the front door and said, "Just leave it in the pool house." Oh, no, 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 no. This will not do. So we told her that Mr. Kane needed to sign the bill of lading. Hand to God, to this day, I have no idea what that even means. But it worked. Larry Kane soon emerges, no doubt having been rustled from the sack after anchoring the late news. He was shirtless, and his fly was down. And before he knows what hit him, the 2 punks are swapping an Instamatic camera and having their pictures taken with him. I had no way of knowing the role that Larry Kane would soon play in my life. Next came high school graduation. You know, it's funny, the things that you say in your yearbook. I paid homage to Supertramp. I was getting ready to head to Lehigh University when came another Forrest Gump-like moment. A much older friend named Bill Snyder, he was then the elected county treasurer in my area. He invited me to join him for breakfast at the home of former Philadelphia Mayor Frank Rizzo. In other words, my pen pal. Those 2 had become friends when Bill, through his landscaping business, had worked on the construction of Rizzo's Tony, controversial home in Philadelphia's Chestnut Hill section. The media delighted in pointing out that there was no way that the mayor's municipal salary could pay for such a mansion. And Bill, my friend Bill, refused to speak to the media, and the mayor never forgot that loyalty. So of course I jumped at the opportunity to accompany Bill to a breakfast that eventually lasted 4 hours. Little did I know I would later be a frequent guest in that home at 8919 Crefeld Street. I was learning important lessons, including that opportunity came to those my age who asked, at least if they were young Republicans. See, the Democrats had a monopoly on all the young people, all the young talent in those days. I stood out, I guess, because I was a teenager interested in the GOP. In the summer of 1980, Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, they joined forces. They are now the Republican ticket, and I'm elated. Remember, I met them both. So that August, Reagan comes back to Philadelphia for a fundraiser, and I am there, wearing my only sport coat. And I guess because of these encounters, I now arrive on campus at Lehigh University full of something and vinegar for the Republican ticket. I soon formed a club that I called Lehigh University Youth for Reagan Bush. It was tough to get anybody interested. So I hatched a plan. A kegger, actually. This was my idea to draw those closeted Reagan Bush supporters out of their dorm rooms. Only the night that I chose conflicted with the Phillies being in the World Series. And nobody came to the kegger. I mean, nobody came to the kegger. Which is why when I got a call thereafter from the actual Reagan Bush campaign asking for the campus club president, I thought I was getting pranked. Remember, from my own phony phone calls, I knew a thing or two about that, but that wasn't the case. It turned out that the future vice president was coming to tour the nearby Bethlehem steel plant, and if you can believe this, in a pre-9/11 world, they desperately needed motorcade drivers. I recruited my entire freshman dorm. We worked on that event. When the visit ended, we lined up on the tarmac and we all shook the hand of George Herbert Walker Bush. I remember being so excited, I had the future vice president sign my event schedule. While still an undergraduate, I was then asked to be an advance man for the sitting vice president of the United States. I interned in his advance office. I traveled several times across the country planning the logistics of his personal appearances and twice around the globe. So of course, my interest in politics continued. It led me to major in government, but my interest in journalism was growing too. Meanwhile, a junior high school friend of mine, Chris Strand, he was now at Temple University studying radio, TV, and film. He had done the KYW News Radio internship with me. And my buddy Chris had a vision. It was a TV short that he wanted to produce that he was convinced we could sell to a young cable platform called HBO. Now, like me, Chris was always hustling too. Summers, I remember that he clammed with his bare feet on Long Beach Island, New Jersey, and then would drive this beat-up old station wagon back to the Philly burbs to sell his fresh clams. Ironic, because he recruited me to invest in his short by telling me that we would sell our video for an amount that would enable each of us to buy a brand new Mercedes, the 190 model, I think, and then we would drive triumphantly back to Philadelphia from New York City. Well, of course I agreed. His idea was called Pay the Price. It was a social commentary about television violence. The subject was the televising of an execution. So in 1985, we each invested a couple of $100 and we produced it. The idea was that television had become so violent that soon we'd be televising executions.
Let's allow him to call the big event. Skip, are you there?
All right, Ray, it was touch and go there for a few minutes, but the mood has certainly picked up here at the Union Penitentiary. There's excitement in the air and you can just feel it.
HBO was just getting started. They weren't interested. Prism was a Philadelphia-based cable outlet, so we submitted it there too. They told us, not funny. It wasn't meant to be. After college graduation, more politics, I ran and was elected as an alternate delegate to the 1984 Republican National Convention in Dallas. I was the youngest member of the Pennsylvania delegation. And then, while in law school at the University of Pennsylvania, at age 23, I ran for an open seat in the Pennsylvania State Legislature, the same seat for which my father had run 6 years prior. I thought it would be a case of a Hollywood ending, but I lost too, by 419 votes. I've since located 236 of those people. That fall, while still a law student, I managed a portion of Senator Arlen Specter's re-election campaign. He won. And then in the spring of my third year of law school, Frank Rizzo, the former Philadelphia mayor, my pen pal, the man that I'd had breakfast with, changed his party from Democrat to Republican to run for his old job, and I became his political director. We were inseparable for a year on the campaign trail. Every day I would accompany Rizzo on his campaign schedule, ending with a sit-down with just the two of us and his driver and his wife Carmela, all at the kitchen table at the house on Crefeld Street. Same kitchen table where I'd sat my senior year of high school. Rizzo won the primary, lost the general election to the only man who ever defeated him in an election, Wilson Goode. And after he lost, we had a highly publicized falling out over which of the two of us would be the Pennsylvania chair of the 1988 George Herbert Walker Bush campaign for president. Well, we both lost that fight. After the story ran, neither of us was the chair. But it was a combination of all of these unique political experiences at an early age that caused me to be invited as a guest on television and radio. One of the people to put me on air, Larry Kane. And that local television exposure would lead me to radio 30 years ago. Saturday, May 19, 1990, I was the guest of a guest host, Brian Tierney, on Philadelphia's 96.5 FM WWDB. The tagline was, "The Talk Station." And DB was this rare FM talker. Brian was a Republican advertising guru, young guy, himself pinch hitting on a Saturday night for the regular host, Tom Marr. And as his guest that night, I was immediately smitten. I'm sure I liked the sound of my own voice. I also thought I had a skill set. And by the following Monday, probably by 9 a.m. the following Monday, I was already crafting my pitch to the station owner, Chuck Schwartz. Quote, "Be advised that given my political and business affiliations, I am confident in my ability to assist in advertising sales in support of such appearances." Well, Chuck Schwartz turned me on to the program director, David Rimmer, and I was given a tryout as a political commentator, but not until someone had vouched for me, Larry Kane. And for the next year, I was a guest of other hosts, always talking politics. And then I was given a guest host gig. And soon I was offered many of the most unpopular fill-in times. Thanksgiving night, New Year's Eve, Super Bowl Sunday. I did them all. But I was now being paid for something that I would gladly have done for free. And of course, Marie Kondo, I saved my first check, signed by Chuck Schwartz's wife, Susan, which was for $85.29. For 2 more years, my guest hosting continued, and it got some important notice. By now, George Herbert Walker Bush had been elected president, the man whose bags I literally carried in college as an advance man, back when he visited Bethlehem Steel, and I was an appointee of his administration. I now held a sub-cabinet level position in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and my job is that I was responsible for all public housing in 5 states plus Washington, D.C. My boss was Jack Kemp. And that's when Philadelphia Magazine gave me a Best of award for moonlighting, for my part-time work as a talk radio host. A few months later, I was given my very own show. Sunday nights from 8 p.m. until midnight. I was ecstatic and terrible. October 3rd, 1993, my first show of my own. I was so damn nervous that you can hear my throat gulp as I introduced the show and got ready to make my first ever opening commentary. A commentary on what? A papal encyclical.
Tonight's a little different, and that's because at this moment I'm kicking off a new and what I'm hoping is going to be a long-standing relationship with the WWDB listeners. This is Michael Smerconish, your Sunday night host here at The Talk Station.
Yikes. A lot there to parse, right? I was the lowest person on the so-called talent totem pole, but I was having fun. Mike Baldini was the lowest of the sales team, and we were 2 young guys starting in the radio biz. He took an interest in my show and sold it. My first advertiser was the Head Nut. They sold nuts and dried fruits and candies, and they are still in business. And Mike Baldini is still my friend. Getting younger listeners was always a struggle for terrestrial AM talk radio, still is. Our station had a solution. Barney the Dinosaur, who was then immensely popular. And the idea was to carry Barney reading bedtime stories for the first 15 minutes of my time slot, hoping that the parents of young kids would put the kids to bed to Barney and then stay tuned in. I was patient, but when convinced that it wasn't helping ratings, I had to fight the dinosaur. Luckily, I slayed the beast. Barney was canceled. For a few years, Sunday night was my domain. I was now married. My wife and I were growing our family, and where Papa Bush had lost to Bill Clinton, ending my presidential appointment, I was now practicing law with a legendary trial lawyer by the name of James E. Beasley and still hosting a Sunday night radio program. And that's when fate interceded. A local radio legend named Dominic Quinn, a morning show guy now in the twilight of his career, suddenly passed away. And I was given the opportunity to move to his time slot weekend mornings. Initially, just to allow listeners to mourn his loss, but after the grieving ended, I kept that slot. So 5:30 till 8 a.m. on Saturdays, and 6 to 9 a.m. on Sundays. Again, that was after practicing law 5 days, so I was now working 7 days a week. But the weekend gig was a really big deal. It was a really big deal for one reason: Sid Mark. Sid was hosting an immensely popular Sunday program playing only the music of Frank Sinatra. In fact, he just recently celebrated his 63rd continuous year. He had a big following then, still does. And as his lead-in, I now had the chance to build audience. It meant, as I say, working 7 days a week while starting a family, but I didn't mind and my wife never complained. The radio business was about to undergo big changes, deregulation. Limits on station ownership were about to be lessened. So Chuck and Susan Schwartz had the chance to sell WWDB for a lot of money. A subsequent owner, seeking to maximize revenue through ad sales so that he could pay his debt service, began selling infomercials disguised as programming. I mean things like colon cleanser. Other hosts had to play along. They had no choice. But me, with my legal practice and reputation to protect, I quit. Immediately, I was asked to join an AM signal that was owned by CBS, formerly known, a real heritage station, as WCAU, and I began hosting Saturday mornings over there from 6 to 9 a.m. I had to rebuild the audience that I'd built across town, but at what was now being referred to as WPHT, I was quickly moved from Saturday mornings to 1 hour of afternoon drive. On my downtown law office, it was wired for radio sound. I would broadcast from there. I'd practice law all day, including trying cases. Then I would host 1 hour of a radio program in afternoon drive. Then they asked me to do 2 hours in afternoon drive. Then they asked me to do 3 hours in afternoon drive. And finally, radio primetime morning drive. I could no longer practice law and be a radio host, so I took the risk of giving up a lucrative legal practice to be a full-time radio host. And it meant a great deal to me that my legal mentor, Jim Beasley, was supportive. Now, I was fully committed to being a talk radio host. And I became obsessed with the ratings. In an era where Arbitron ratings were determined by people who were paid $1 and asked to keep track of all of their weekly listening, I charted every change in the demographics. Soon we had success. Special hat tip to Greg Stocker, who was then my young puka shell flip-flop wearing board op. I would later dance at his wedding, and today he and his wife are expecting their first child. Morning Drive brought notoriety. Increasingly, invites to be a television guest came my way. First locally, you guessed it, Larry Kane put me on television.
Michael Smerconish, a longtime political analyst. Have you ever seen anything like this?
Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, in 1987,
Larry was a booster of mine until his own sign-off from CBS 3.
I'd like to thank the people I work with at the station. I'd also like to acknowledge a group of people who have entrusted their careers with me by letting me help them. Young people like Colette Cassidy and radio personality Michael Smerconish. Teaching has been the most gratifying part of my job.
Another local anchor who put me on air was Mark Howard. He had a popular Sunday morning program called Inside Story on the local ABC affiliate. And then came national opportunity. CNN had a live afternoon program called Talk Back Live, hosted by Arthel Neville. And I became a frequent guest. And suddenly, I was invited to guest host that show. This was a big deal for me. I was scared to death when I traveled to Atlanta to host a live national television program. And I almost passed out when on the first day, September 19, 2002, when the show went live, my microphone didn't work. And I just kept talking. Still, it sounds like everything was going my way, right? By now, like everybody else with a local show of their own, I wanted my own nationally syndicated radio program and a TV show to boot. But both were proving to be very elusive. If you looked at my radio and television history on a graph, and I don't know why you would, but it would seemingly tell a story of steady progress. You know, guest host, weekend host, afternoon host, morning host. But that would be misleading. It's just not the way that life works. There were many setbacks along the way, some of my own making. Like when, at the height of my morning radio success, Philadelphia Magazine profiled me, and the photographer came to my house and had a brainstorm that I should be naked in my own driveway. I took it as a dare, and impulsively I agreed. Philadelphia Magazine, April issue 2009. What the hell was I thinking? For weeks, I walked around with my tail between my legs, those legs, disappointed that I'd embarrassed my family. I'm sure that my job was saved only by the revenue that my program was then generating. I was hosting a morning radio program that did very well in what was then the nation's fourth largest media market. And at that time, nationally, Bill O'Reilly was the biggest name in cable TV, and he too had a radio show, a nationally syndicated radio program on hundreds of stations across the nation. And soon I got the call to fill in for him.
Now, the Radio Factor with Bill O'Reilly.
Hi, everybody. You're tuned to the Radio Factor. I am not Bill O'Reilly. Bill's on assignment today. My name is Michael Smerconish, and I'm coming to you from the great swing state of Pennsylvania.
Pretty soon, most any time that O'Reilly vacationed, I hosted his program. I thought that I was paying my dues, and I wanted a syndicated show of my own, just like he and Hannity and Limbaugh. At that time, I aspired to be their equal. But when Bill O'Reilly decided to retire from radio, his syndicator, Westwood One, they didn't hire me. They said they wanted a name. So instead they hired former actor, former U.S. Senator Fred Thompson, who you might remember because he was in the movie The Hunt for Red October with Sean Connery and Alec Baldwin. Other syndicators also took a pass on me. They told me that I was a capable national understudy, but they said that I lacked the edge that was then in demand. And I was striking out on TV. After getting exposure on local network affiliates in Philadelphia, I was excited when MSNBC called to ask that I fill in for one of their hosts, Joe Scarborough, who then had a 10 p.m. program called Scarborough Country. And just as with O'Reilly on radio, this became a regular gig. Scarborough missed many shows due to a bad back, so I got lots of fill-in work on his show. Right now in Scarborough Country, the lady walks. Andrea Yates admitted drowning her 5 children, but today she walked out of jail on her way to a mental hospital. Is it just another case of a high-profile defendant manipulating the insanity defense? Many nights I would host Scarborough's show until 11 p.m. in Secaucus, New Jersey, and then I would sleep in the back of a town car en route to Philadelphia only to get up late. 4 a.m. was late for me instead of 3 a.m., my normal time, so that I could host my own morning radio program. Again, paying my dues. Suddenly, 2007, Don Imus, the MSNBC morning man, was fired for an inappropriate comment. And quickly, they put me in Imus's seat. I was given a week-long tryout on live television. Would I be Imus's successor? Matt Drudge and others wanted to know. Good Monday morning, everybody. I'm Michael Smerconish. For those of you in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware are, as usual, tuned to the Big Talker 1210, based in Philadelphia. It's 5 minutes after the hour, and the experiment, the 3-day experiment, begins. I called in lots of chits for special guests that week. On the first day, my final guest was John Anderson, the lead singer of my favorite band, Yes, now Rock and Roll Hall of Famers. Anderson sang Roundabout that morning on national television. And before I left the studio, there was this announcement that Steve Kappas was on the line. Philly guy, Temple graduate. He was then the president of NBC News. Excited that this might be the call. I reached for the phone. Oh no, he doesn't want to speak to you. I was told he wants to talk to John Anderson. Seems that Kappas was also a Yes fan, eager to talk with the rock star and not with me. My final guest of that week of fill-in was Joe Scarborough, who I remember was effusive in his praise of my work. Well, I didn't get the Imus time slot. They gave it to Joe Scarborough, whose back must have healed. He soon launched Morning Joe. I was never invited to be his guest. Worse, I didn't get the Scarborough time slot either. Now came the 2008 presidential campaign. MSNBC launched a daily program called Race for the White House, and they named David Gregory the host. I became a regular guest panelist. So too was an Air America radio personality named Rachel Maddow, and Jay Carney, the Washington bureau chief for Time magazine. We appeared often together. When the presidential campaign ended with President Obama's election, David Gregory was asked to host Meet the Press. Rachel Maddow was given her own show in prime time, and Jay Carney was named Director of Communications for Vice President Biden and later became Press Secretary for Barack Obama. Me, I was the only one not to get a new job. And my two colleagues who did get TV shows of their own never invited me on their programs. So instead, I continued to host my own radio program and do more television fill-in work, often now for another Philly guy, Chris Matthews, on MSNBC's Hardball. All shook up, a change at the top of the McCain campaign. Chris is off, and that means I get to say, let's play hardball. This went on for 5 years. Whenever Matthews vacationed, I was in his chair, just as I had done for Joe Scarborough, just as I had done for Bill O'Reilly, and just as I would do for Glenn Beck on HLN. Here's the funny thing. There were days when I guest hosted for both O'Reilly and Matthews. I would do my own radio program, then I would guest host Bill O'Reilly's show in New York City from noon to 2. I would leave Fox News and walk 2 blocks north on Avenue of the Americas and walk into 30 Rock and guest host Hardball. I remember telling my friends at the time that I didn't know whether the risk was higher of me getting shot in the chest or shot in the back, but it was rare to be able to navigate between those two worlds. My ratings on Hardball were strong. For 5 years, I was Matthew's go-to person, and of course, I really wanted a television program of my own. Finally, MSNBC offered to shoot a pilot. I was asked, what do you want to call your proposed show? And I said, I want to call it Politics Nation. Well, MSNBC didn't like my pilot, but they liked the title of the show. So they created a show for Al Sharpton, and they let him use it. The president of MSNBC, Phil Griffin, used candor that I appreciated, even though his words stung. He said that where my fill-in work was respected at the network, I would never have a show of my own there. Smirk, he said, we are young, liberal, and nerdy, and you are none of the above. There were more pilots made. A few were for CNN that were never picked up, and one was of my creation, with the support of 2 other Philadelphians, Pat Croce, my friend and neighbor, and filmmaker Tim Chambers. And my idea was for a show called Book Club with Michael Smerconish, me talking with authors about books. And I still love the concept. Terror on American soil. CIA operative suspected of killing European agent. Hero cop fighting for freedom. They may sound like headlines that have been plucked from today's newspaper, but when you add in pulse-pounding drama, when you add in a wisecracking wit, when you add in a sexy, smart love interest, then you can gently transition from the hard news to the hard cover. I'm Michael Smerconish. Welcome to Book Club. The assigned CNN producer, Joel Cheatwood, told me that he would greenlight that pilot. And I thought, this is it. But soon, he was hired to run Fox Business Channel. My pilot fell into a dark hole. After many local successes, but so many national rejections, I gave serious consideration to returning to the practice of law. It looked like I'd tapped out on radio and TV, that I would forever be regarded as the dependable backup, the Nick Foles of broadcasting. Finally, in 2012, after CNN had been struggling, Time Warner hired Jeff Zucker to be the worldwide president. Zucker had previously been the executive producer of The Today Show when he was only 26 years old, a career path that would lead to his being president of NBC, Universal, and finally CNN. A couple of months after he landed at CNN, I met him briefly at the White House Correspondent Association dinner. We didn't exactly bump into one another. I went looking for him at a party so as to introduce myself. Zucker invited me to contact him, and I did. The following day by email, then by phone, and then by overnight mail. He didn't reply. So I continued my radio and television work. The good news is that by now my radio show had been syndicated. I was on about 80 stations across the country. Talkers Magazine said that I had the 9th largest radio audience in the nation, but the clearances were not all live. Thankfully, I was offered to come to SiriusXM in a deal negotiated by a SiriusXM executive named Dave Gorab, who had also cut his teeth at the old WWDB in Philadelphia. Small world. My new show launched on SiriusXM April 15, 2013.
On the Michael Smerconish program, Angry is over. And now, here's Michael Smerconish.
Hey everybody, welcome to POTUS. Yeah, the day has finally arrived. Sorry that it's tax day as well. I'm Michael Smerconish, and thank you so much for listening to me on day one. SiriusXM has been a great radio partner for me, and the POTUS channel a perfect fit. I appreciate the whole crew in D.C., especially Dan Henning, who keeps me on air. The POTUS channel has given me the opportunity to prove that you need not be doctrinaire in order to succeed on air. And I have to say, I credit Howard Stern for paving the way, because without him, I don't know that there'd be a SiriusXM. I launched at SiriusXM in the spring of 2013, while still at MSNBC guest hosting Hardball for Chris Matthews. But having a TV show of my own, that still eluded me. The winter of 2013 into 2014, Matthews vacationed at Christmas. I spent my holiday guest hosting his program, and the positive ratings warranted a small notice on a website that caters to the cable TV world. So I forwarded the mention to Jeff Zucker at CNN. This time, I got his attention. He invited me to meet with him the following day. How to get there became an issue. The Northeast was in the midst of an ice storm. Amtrak was operating at a reduced schedule. Our eldest son was then a senior in high school, and he drove a Jeep. The only way that I could get to New York City was to drive his vehicle. Now, this son is a rocket scientist, a perfect SAT brainiac. But common sense, not always his strong suit. He hadn't screwed the Jeep's roof on properly, causing it to leak and the interior to fill with ice. So I drove to the big meeting on the New Jersey Turnpike, slipping and sliding inside and outside. In my first real meeting with Zucker, we seemed to bond. He was no BS. There would be no pilot. In a conversation that didn't last 15 minutes, he offered me a show of my own on CNN. And when I retrieved the Jeep from the parking lot next door, the ice had melted. Soaked, I celebrated all the way back to Philadelphia. Within just 2 months, the show launched. Hey, good morning. I'm Michael Smerconish. I have worked in television as a commentator and guest host for years, but I have always wanted a program of my own. And this is it. My first day on CNN as the host of my own program was the exact same day that airplane MH370 went missing. I didn't mention it on my first show, but for the next 9 or so months, that subject would be the focus of most of my programs. At long last, a national radio platform and a TV show of my own. And maybe by this time there was a reason that my luck had changed. She goes by the initials TC. She had joined me after I got my break to do Morning Drive. My initial morning show producer had been hired for me by CBS, looked great on paper. Had all the requisite radio credentials, but we had no chemistry, and he didn't last. I knew TC from the Montessori school where all 4 of our children have been educated. She was a Harvard grad who was working as a teacher's assistant in Mrs. Schwar's class. All the parents loved her with their kids, but she'd been bitten by a media bug, doing, of all things, selling flameless candles on QVC.
This one that I'm holding in my hand is a Candle Impressions candle, and then this one is a flame-lit candle, and you can't tell the difference.
Bright, cheerful, competent. I invited her to come to my radio studio one day to observe, and she never left. It was a struggle for me to get her hired by CBS because on paper, she made no sense for the job. I'd like my Morning Drive producer in the 4th largest market in the country to be a Montessori teacher who sells flameless candles. Tough sell. I had a great program director named Grace Blazer. In the end, she relented. I guess there's a lesson in that, for all of us to look for competence more so than credentials. Today, I'm where I want to be. I host a daily radio program that bears my name. It's heard coast to coast on satellite radio. I have a weekly cable television program that is viewed internationally, and I've authored 7 books. Yes, I'm pleased with those achievements, but I am far more proud of what went into them. Navigating the roadblocks, overcoming the rejection. Nothing has fallen into my lap. I know people to whom things have come effortlessly. So do you. But that has never been my experience. I am so fortunate. My political, my media work, my interests, they've given me a very rich life. I met Ronald Reagan as a newly minted 18-year-old. I worked in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration when I was just 29. I once had a 7-hour dinner with Fidel Castro at his house. I got to take former Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf to vote with me at my suburban Philadelphia polling place. I confronted the living members of Led Zeppelin with a demand that they reunite. You can watch it on YouTube. It didn't go so well. I heckled Pink Floyd co-founder Roger Waters from the front row of Madison Square Garden because I didn't like his support for Gitmo detainees, and then I later enjoyed his company at dinner. I spent a year in the campaign car with former Philadelphia Mayor Frank Rizzo, listening to his stories. I worked for and befriended Pennsylvania's longest-serving United States Senator Arlen Specter. I once brought pro wrestler Bruno Sammartino to my law office. I've been able to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for 9/11 related charities because of my longest radio sponsor and my friend, Steven Singer. One night, I spent the same evening hanging out with Pete Rose and then Ted Nugent. I shared an uncomfortable train ride with former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke. I drank champagne from the Stanley Cup and even had my portrait painted at a fundraiser in front of a live audience by famed artist Nelson Shanks. I twice interviewed President Barack Obama from the White House. The first was August 20, 2009. I'm live at the White House, and I'm joined by the President of the United States. Mr. President, what an honor for me, and thank you, sir, for this privilege, and thank you for coming back to my radio program.
Michael, it's great to be on the show again. Every time we've been on, it's been a great time, so I appreciate the opportunity.
The second time I interviewed President Obama was in the Oval Office in 2012, and that hand holding the boom microphone, it belongs to an engineer named Dave Scalish, a wonderful guy who had to hold in that position for 30 minutes. I was convinced he was going to pass out. No interview yet, but I also had a private one-on-one chat with President Trump in the same place. So many great memories. Many involve celebrity moments. You know, interviewing people of stature like John McCain or Colin Powell, or some of the sports heroes of my youth. Smokin' Joe Frazier, or Bernie Parent, whose jersey I wore as a little kid. I've been proud to advocate for Maureen Faulkner, whose police officer husband was murdered by a guy named Mumia Abu Jamal. He then became an international celebrity while on death row. My radio program became a clubhouse of pro-Faulkner citizens to counter an international campaign of disinformation on behalf of the man convicted of murdering Danny Faulkner. I'll never forget the night that W called me live election night, November 7, 2000. I was at a steakhouse doing a remote broadcast with just about an hour to go in the polls.
Hello, Governor.
Michael, how are you?
I'm terrific. How you doing?
Good. I'm in Austin, Texas.
Hey, Governor, we wish you Godspeed tonight.
Thank you, buddy. A lot of it's going to come down to the great state of Pennsylvania, and that's why I'm calling, Michael.
I loved hosting the members of Rock and Roll Hall of Famers, Yes, live in my studio, and then, believe it or not, live in my backyard for a barbecue. And I can even laugh now about that night in 2007 when Bill Maher mistook me for an evangelical Christian.
I believe in the Ten Commandments.
So, like, you can't work on Sunday, and you can't swear, and you can't make statues to other gods?
I think it's a good way to lead your life. You follow those, you're going to be better than if
I'm
you
asking, those things are important to you? Not swearing and not working on Sunday and not making statues to gods?
Bill, I didn't want to get diverted on the Ten Commandments. I believe
I'm just asking you if those are... If you had to make a list of the 10 most important things in the world, you'd leave off rape and child abuse, but you'd put in no swearing and not working on Sunday?
What I'm trying to tell
You need to calm down. That's what
I think I'm one of the only who sort of got an apology from him.
And I was reading from this Media Matters for America. They talked about this Michael Smerconish, who was on our show a couple of weeks ago, very thoughtful guy. And they said, Michael Smerconish repeatedly discussed the sissification of America, claiming that political correctness has made the United States a nation of sissies. Well, you know what? If you're complaining like this, you are a sissy.
Well, that's...
And Michael Smerconish was right.
I'll tell you what.
I'm often asked, who was your favorite guest? It's an easy answer. It's a twofer, actually. Wild Bill Guarnier and Babe Heffron. And it happened on October 3rd, 2007. I was then hosting Morning Drive on 1210 AM WPHT in Philadelphia. And that day, Bill Guarnier and Babe Heffron, two quintessential Philly guys, South Philly guys turned world heroes, joined me in studio. Wild Bill, welcome back, my friend. It's good to see you.
Good to be here again.
You look good to me. I know recently your health has been an issue. You feeling all right?
I feel wonderful. Thank you.
Who's this fella that you brought with you?
Hey, that's the little guy from South Philly, Babe Heffron.
These World War II paratroopers were the embodiment of the greatest generation. They were both featured prominently in Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers. Wild Bill Guarnier jumped on D-Day, landed in Saint-Marie-Glace. Babe Heffron infiltrated and seized Hitler's private lair called Eagle's Nest. The day of the interview, Wild Bill came in on crutches, having discarded the prosthetic leg that he'd been provided after losing his own at the Battle of the Bulge. Yeah. They were my favorite interview. You didn't know each other in South Philly.
No.
You meet in England when you're both wearing the uniform of your country.
Yeah. That's right.
Which one of you remembers that meeting better?
I remember very well.
Tell me, Wild Bill.
The way he walked. They got to walk. He walked like a guy from South Philly. I could tell. It's amazing how you can tell just by the walk.
The two of you fight side by side in Holland and in Belgium, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Bill, Wild Bill lost his leg at the Battle of the Bulge.
I had to lose my leg. I'm glad to lose my life, that's all. That's all. Lucky to be alive.
Favorite guests, hands down. But if you asked me about my favorite unguested segment, I'd have a different answer. Time flies. My wife Lavinia and I have raised 4. And our kids, they've provided me better talk radio fodder than any front page news. When our daughter was 8 years old, she went to camp in North Carolina. It was supposed to be 2 weeks. There was no word from her for the first 6 days. And then a bundle of letters arrived. They were funny. They were heartbreaking. Here's letter number 1. Camp is fun. At 1, we have lunch. We had today pizza with cheddar cheese, pepperoni mushrooms, and anchovies, I think. By the next letter, things were changing. Come and get me now, all caps. The pool has snakes, jellyfish, and frogs. Then came letter number 3 to her mother. Every day I think of you and cry. Like today, it was raining, and you always take me to the movies on rainy days. Finally, letter number 4. I hate it, and I'm sick of the word y'all. Here's your assignment. Get me home or else. So far, I've cried 28 times. Get me out of here, H-E-A-R. Well, you know me. I need material. So I gathered up those letters and more, and I read them on air. And there was a gender divide in the audience. Men called, and they said, I went to camp, and there was always a kid like yours, and you better leave her there to tough it out, or she'll be scarred for life. And then women would call, and they would say 2 things. They would say, how dare you invade her privacy by reading these letters? And then they would say, you better go get her, or she'll be scarred for life. As I was on air, my wife was pulling a SEAL Team 6 rescue mission and brought her back safely. Our daughter came home. But it was good radio. And you know who told me? Conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats, independents. And there's a lesson in that. By the way, she went back to camp, different camp, the next summer. Today she's married, living happily in Brooklyn. This is her wedding day. No doubt, I've changed in the last 30 years. I think we all do. What separates me from everybody else is that my opinions are all captured on audio and videotapes or enshrined in columns that I've written. In my case, I've moved from a reliably Republican voter to a registered independent. And we could have a good chat as to which changed more, me or the Republican Party. I would argue that the Republican Party today doesn't resemble the GOP that I joined in 1980. And, admittedly, nor do I resemble the 18-year-old who couldn't decide whether to vote for George Herbert Walker Bush or Ronald Reagan. There have been a lot of milestones in my journey, but one of them stands out. It was a trip that I took in 2006, in the midst of the Iraq War. I was a military tourist on the taxpayer's dime. It was a Pentagon-sponsored trip. They called it the Joint Civilian Orientation Conference, or JCOC. It's a military immersion program that began post-World War II with the goal of building citizenship awareness of military functions. So I was part of this hand-selected group of about 24 Americans, and in the span of 1 week, we traveled 15,000 miles. We visited 4 Middle Eastern countries. We had this amazing itinerary. A briefing by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld at the Pentagon, the boarding of the USS Iwo Jima by helicopter in the Persian Gulf. We fired the best of the Army's weaponry in the Kuwait Desert, just 10 miles from Iraq. We drove in an 11-kilometer Humvee obstacle course that was designed to protect against IEDs. We boarded the Air Force's most secret, sophisticated surveillance aircraft in Qatar. And we toured a military outpost, a humanitarian outpost in the Horn of Africa. It was in Djibouti. So I returned home from this program impressed with the men and women who wore the uniform of our country overseas, but also convinced that here we were 5 years removed from September 11, no longer making the hunt for bin Laden a priority. This trip was 2 years after the 2004 election, an election in which I had emceed President Bush's final Pennsylvania campaign rally, 20,000 people in a suburban cornfield. But I was increasingly disenchanted with the administration because I thought that they'd taken their eye off the ball with regard to the hunt for bin Laden. And more than any other issue, this is what would eventually lead me to support Barack Obama for president. When Senator Obama first came on my radio program, 2008, he repeated that he would take the hunt for bin Laden to Pakistan if necessary, and that was long before anybody knew that bin Laden was hiding at Abbottabad. And for saying so, he was ridiculed by Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, John McCain, and others. Well, we know how that ended.
It looks like for 6.5 years we've been outsourcing the hunt for bin Laden to a guy with no motivation to get him. You agree with my assessment, and what are you going to do to change it?
You may be aware of the fact that I made a speech in August. You remember I got criticized.
Not by me, Senator. I applauded you.
I know.
Look, by the time I went to the Middle East as a Pentagon guest, I was already leery of the Bush administration for what I thought was a lack of prosecuting the hunt for bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. And then I came home convinced that was the case. And I was open to the idea that Barack Obama would be different in that regard. But I'll tell you another way that I like to chart my change. It's by looking at who I requested to blurb my books. I've written 7 of them. The first was in 2004. It was called Flying Blind, and it dealt with airport security post 9/11. So, whose blurb appears on the front jacket? That would be Sean Hannity, who said, Michael Smerconish is saying what many Americans are thinking, we need to have this debate. And Hannity wasn't the only conservative. On the back jacket, Michelle Malkin offers this praise. Fasten your seatbelts and prepare to be enraged in Flying Blind. Michael Smerconish exposes how politically correct transportation bureaucrats put sensitivity over security and endanger us all for the sake of protecting diversity. My second book, 2007, Muzzled. Front jacket, Bill O'Reilly. Michael Smerconish talks the talk. If you say unpopular things, watch out. Using vivid examples of PC rubbish, Muzzled will lead you into a world that would terrify Rod Serling. An entertaining and provocative book. I didn't solicit political figures for book number 3, which I wrote on behalf of Maureen Faulkner, the widow of a Philadelphia police officer named Daniel Faulkner. It was published in 2007. And in this instance, the blurbs were supplied by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Buzz Bissinger and the former police commissioner of Philadelphia, John Timmody. And it was pretty much the same with my next book, number 4 in 2009, which is Instinct. Instinct tells the story of the hero who prevented the 20th hijacker from entering the United States, a real patriot named Jose Melendez Perez. So in this instance, I went with former PA governor, former Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge. But things are now changing by book number 5. In 2009, I published a memoir of sorts called Morning Drive. And who wrote the blurbs? I'm looking at the back jacket and I am seeing Hardball's Chris Matthews, Senator Arlen Specter, and Governor Ed Rendell, the latter of whom said this: Michael Smerconish doesn't part on ideology or a partisan political agenda. He sure as heck isn't predictable. It's that same independence and unpredictability that makes Morning Drive a great read. 2014, book number 6 was my novel, Talk. This was much more of a commercial play. For most of my books, I've donated all the proceeds to charity. In this instance, I went with the hottest political authors of the era, the authors of Game Change and Double Down. That would be Mark Halpern and John Heilemann. And I was thrilled to enlist my own favorite writer of fiction, Nelson DeMille. But finally comes my most recent book, published in 2018, Clowns to the Left of Me, Jokers to the Right, American Life in Columns. Transformation complete. The foreword was written by President Obama's senior advisor, David Axelrod, and the quote on the back jacket comes from the Governator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who said, Michael Smerconish is the rare political observer who can get pumped up over important weighty subjects like gerrymandering and closed primaries. He's a post-partisan problem solver who is trying to restore sanity to the political process. If only more of the country could be as passionate as Smerconish about the need for change, we could end partisan gridlock and get our politicians working for the people again. Fire up a stogie and enjoy this book. Sure, I have changed, and the Republican Party has changed, but I argue that the media business has changed much more. When I got started 30 years ago at WWDB, personality mattered, not ideology. The headliners were all local and quite a carpool. Irv Homer, Susan Bray, Dominic Quinn, Frank Ford, Bernie Herman. They weren't on air because they shared a political perspective. They were on air because they all had personality. They could tell stories. You know, Homer was this acerbic libertarian before the rest of us knew what that meant or had heard of Ron or Rand Paul. I remember Susan Bray. She had this sultry voice, and she was from down under. She billed herself as the saucy Aussie. Frank Ford was an unabashed liberal married to the Democratic Philadelphia district attorney, the so-called tough cookie Lynn Abraham. Dominic Quinn was a conservative, but he was perhaps best known for his tremendous command of the English language. And Bernie Herman, his moniker, what today we would call his brand, was that he was the gentleman of broadcasting. I often guest hosted for him. Let me tell you something. Today, you can get hired with that reputation. These hosts didn't share ideology. There were no mutual talking points. What they had in common was the ability to make the telephones ring. But AM radio was in trouble when I was getting started. FM was growing. AM needed a savior. And it got one. His name, Rush Limbaugh. And the first Gulf War was the backdrop against which things changed. Rush was hired on Sacramento's KFBK. This after the firing of Morton Downey Jr. You remember Downey gesticulating, cursing at guests, chain smoking on set. He was the one who stole the spotlight from the more sedate, the more cerebral likes of Phil Donahue or Oprah or Sally Jessy Raphael. Downey was canned on radio after he told an ethnic joke on air. Enter Rush Limbaugh. Rush was the former promotions director for the Kansas City Royals. He quickly became the top talk show host in Sacramento. Then he was placed into national syndication in 1988. And Limbaugh's impact on talk radio was transformative. Pre-internet, before Fox News, long before satellite radio, conservatives, I argue, rightfully felt shut out of the mainstream media. News junkies had NBC, ABC, CBS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, which all leaned left. Limbaugh is a gifted showman who filled that void by establishing a clubhouse for conservatives. And soon, every major market would have Limbaugh and a stable of his imitators. Philadelphia, my market, the last major market in the country to take Rush's show. And that's because my station owner, Chuck Schwartz, believed that a local radio station should have locally based hosts. But he knew that if he didn't take Limbaugh, a competitor would build a radio station around him. And so Rush joined the WWDB lineup. And when Fox News launched on television in 1996, it adopted the AM talk radio playbook. Later, MSNBC. took note of that success, briefly gained viewers by giving Keith Olbermann a Downey-like platform for his diatribes against President George W. Bush. Anybody remember his claim that Bush was, quote, urinating on the Constitution? And now the business model for much of the media was toned down as a version of that which Morton Downey had established. Entertainment masked as news, constant conflict, good guys versus bad guys, and preordained outcomes, just like what? Pro wrestling. Good for ratings, good for revenue, bad for the country. This media paradigm has fathered and taken a toll on the way in which we're governed. There's been a huge uptick in incivility and polarization among our leaders in the exact same time period in which the media has moved to extremes. That's largely because of the power that Morton Downey's successors exert over primary voters. This rise in polarization in Washington, it correlates with the broadcast changes that I'm describing. Only, I don't just see correlation. I see causation too. Consider this. For most of the time that I've been a broadcaster, the National Journal has tracked the ideological leanings of Congress. And according to the Journal, pre-Limbaugh, on Ronald Reagan's watch, 60% of the House and Senate was comprised of moderates. In 1982, 58 senators and 344 House members had voting records that put them between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. In other words, there were so many Republican Senate moderates on Ronald Reagan's watch that they had their own weekly gathering. They called themselves the Wednesday Lunch Club. The members included Alan Simpson and Ted Stevens and Nassi Katzenbaum, John Hines, Arlen Specter, Bob Packwood, Bob Dole. Today, there would be no members showing up for lunch. By 2010, every Senate Republican was more conservative than every Senate Democrat, and every Senate Democrat was more liberal than every Senate Republican. And the House is similarly divided. Here's another barometer of change in the last 30 years. According to the Congressional Quarterly, as late as the 1970s, the typical member of one party voted with his or her party colleagues just over 60% of the time. In fact, my favorite example is a Texas congressman by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush. Papa Bush was in Congress, and he overlapped the administrations of Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Well, guess what? Congressman Bush voted with the Democratic Johnson administration about as often as he voted with the Republican Nixon administration. And that was typical then. But by 2010, the typical member of Congress voting with party members 90% of the time. Look, I'm not blaming polarization on just the media. Other factors have driven the divide. They include a lack of campaign finance reform. That causes nonstop fundraising. They don't have any time to socialize with one another. Hyperpartisan districts are an issue. The spread of politically homogeneous communities are a problem. We're self-sorting. Closed primaries are an issue. I'll tell you what else is an issue. Social media. The beer muscles that come from the anonymity online, that has fueled incivility and polarization. But mostly I see a causal connection between the media influence and polarization. Gridlock is what you get when Washington takes its cues from those with microphones and not the vast majority of the people. When politicians take their cues from the pro wrestling of the modern era, the nation suffers. Our climate won't improve until we do something about that. And in order for that to happen, more people need to change the channel. That, more than anything else, is what I wish I knew before I started talking. One last thing. Among the many pleasures that I have had over the years is working with interns who've sought my guidance. I know that one of them will far surpass my achievements. I'm just not sure who it'll be. Probably many will. They've all been extraordinary. Anthony Mazzarelli was first. He was then in both law and med school. Today, he runs a major urban health system. Ben Haney was a Notre Dame student who I put on air reporting when he drove to Washington just to pay respects to President Reagan, who was lying in repose. Today, he's a successful real estate investor. Josh Belfer began interning for me as an 8th grader. His father would drop him off and wait in the parking lot. Today, he's in a pediatric residency. The cover photo for my book Morning Drive was taken by Olivia Dubendorf, an intern with a penchant for photography. Today, she's finishing her master's degree. And recently, an example of things coming full circle, I quoted on air and posted a CNBC story on my website before I realized that it was written by Maggie Fitzgerald, who worked for me while studying at Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. I can only hope that I've offered them the sort of guidance that Larry Kane provided to me. 30 years from now, it'll be their turn to reminisce. Thank you.